So today we're going to talk about something that, well, it really challenges the way most of us think about domestic violence. We're going to dive into the findings from the book, Men's Experiences of Violence in Intimate Relationships, which gives a voice to a side of this issue we just don't hear about enough. Okay, let's start with a quick thought experiment. When I say the words domestic violence victim, who do you see in your mind's eye? Seriously, just take a second. Hold on to that image, because the study we're looking at today is probably going to make you rethink it. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to try and bring this unseen victim into the light. Because the study we're explaining today, it isn't about crunching numbers. It's about putting the real, lived experiences of men front and center. And that's a perspective that is so often missing from the conversation. You know, there's this powerful narrative we have as a society. It kind of goes like this. Violence against men, that happens out there, on the street, in a public place. But violence in here, inside a home, we automatically think that's something that happens to women. This book says, hang on, we can't just assume that. We have to actually look at what's really happening. So where is all this coming from? Well, the book is based on these really in-depth interviews with 28 men in Norway. But here's the thing, it's not about stats. The whole point was to understand what they went through in their own words. It's what researchers call a phenomenological approach, which is really just a fancy way of saying they wanted to see the world through these men's eyes. Okay, now we're getting to the absolute heart of the study. And this is where it is really eye-opening. Now, physical violence, that was a real thing for over half the guys they interviewed. But the researchers found that the most constant, the most damaging, the most systematic form of abuse they went through was something else entirely. Just listen to this quote from one of the men, Tom. He's remembering what his partner would say right after their guests had left. You see how this isn't physical? It's all psychological. It's not about a single punch. It's more like a slow poison, designed to isolate him and make him think that he's the problem. And in this next example, you can really see how control is just weaponized fear. The threat to Frederick wasn't about his own safety. No, it was aimed right at the center of his world, his children. The kids were being used as leverage, as a tool to keep him constantly terrified and on edge. And this quote from Tom again, man, this one really captures what it feels like to live like that. It puts you in this state of constant alert, what experts call hyper-vigilance. You're always scanning for danger, always reading the room. As the book puts it, these men started walking on tiptoe, absolutely terrified of doing or saying the one thing that might set off an explosion. So you can see, these aren't just one-off bad days, right? This is a pattern, a system of control. The study found these tactics popping up again and again, slowly chipping away at their self-worth, the constant criticism, using kids as weapons, threats, controlling the money, and always making them feel like everything was their fault. So what does all this do to the men going through it? Well, it creates this massive internal conflict, a really painful clash between what they're living through at home and what society is telling them a real man is supposed to be. They're stuck in what's called a double bind, basically a trap with no obvious way out. Just think about it for a second. On one side, you have the cultural script for being a man. You've got to be tough, the sturdy oak, always in control. Now compare that with the reality for these men. A totally eroded sense of self, living in fear. Even the rule that men don't hit women gets turned into a weapon against them, forcing them to just take it. And that pressure to never seem weak or vulnerable, it just piles on more shame and isolation. So how on earth do they deal with that? It's an impossible situation. Well, instead of giving up on being a man, they redefined it. For John, and a lot of the other men in this study, real manliness wasn't about fighting back. It was about having the strength not to. It's this incredible act of resistance, really, even if it meant they had to endure more abuse. And then, if that wasn't enough, there's this other really twisted layer of manipulation, a tactic the researchers call gender switching. The abusive partner would just completely flip the story. They would use that exact stereotype we talked about in the beginning and tell friends, family, even professionals that he was the one being abusive. Can you imagine how isolating that is? You're not just the victim, you're being painted as the bad guy. So what's the actual human cost of living like this? And what happens when these men finally work up the courage to ask for help? Well, unfortunately, they often run smack into a wall of disbelief. The emotional toll is it's devastating. You see huge rates of anxiety and depression, this deep sense of being totally alone, and a lot of guys turning to alcohol just to cope. The abuse just systematically strips away their sense of self-worth, and for some, it even leads to suicidal thoughts. One man actually said he felt like he had been obliterated entirely. And when they finally did reach out for help, they often found themselves facing this really frustrating reality, summed up in this one powerful phrase from the book. They discovered they were seen as the wrong sort of victim. But why? Well, it's because their story just didn't fit the mold, the stereotype. The very people who are supposed to help, counselors, support agencies, they often couldn't see past his gender. They just couldn't wrap their heads around him being the victim. Sometimes they'd even shift the focus back to his partner, assuming she must be the one who really needed support. So, where does all this leave us? What do we do with this? Well, the experiences of these men really force us to rethink our whole understanding of partner violence. They challenge us to look past gender and focus on the actual dynamics of control and abuse. And this is really the key takeaway, the heart of the matter. What this study shows so clearly is that in these abusive relationships, real power isn't about who's physically stronger. Real power comes from psychological control. And that kind of control can turn anyone into a victim, regardless of their size or their gender. And that leaves us with one last really crucial question. If the experiences of these men teach us that vulnerability to this kind of violence is a human issue, not just a gendered one, then what's next? The challenge for our support systems and for all of us is to finally learn how to see the victim first and leave the stereotype behind for good.